In 1976, a sleep researcher deliberately wrecked healthy volunteers' deepest sleep. 3 nights later, those healthy people had widespread body pain, crushing fatigue, and tender points in exactly the same places fibromyalgia patients get them. They were not just tired, what they had for those 3 days looked a lot like the actual disease, manufactured on purpose in a lab. For 50 years, fibromyalgia patients have been told mostly that their broken sleep is just another symptom of the pain. That might actually be backwards. We'll get into the experiment that started this idea, why nobody ever ran the big study that should have followed it, what your genes have to do with who this applies to, and one cheap blood test that very few people with fibromyalgia are offered. Fibromyalgia is widespread pain and exhaustion that doesn't show up on any scan or blood test. For decades, that made it easy to write it off as stress or as something even imagined, but that has changed. Earlier this year, the largest genetic study ever done on fibromyalgia found over 24 risk regions in the genome, clustered in the brain and nervous system, not the joints and not the muscles. So we know it's real, and we know that genetics plays a real part. Now, you'd think at that point that we know what actually switches it on. We don't. Not for certain, at least. The official answer, even today, is that it's multifactorial. Genetics, environment, the nervous system, probably all working together, which is true and not particularly helpful if you are the person who's suffering with it. So here's the uncommon question. Of everything on that list, is there one factor that's both measurable and something you could do something about? There's a candidate, and it's been sitting in the research for decades. The assumption that almost everyone makes, doctors included, is that fibromyalgia causes bad sleep. The pain keeps you awake, so of course your sleep is affected. It just makes sense. But that 1976 experiment that I opened with wasn't testing people with fibromyalgia at all. It was actually testing healthy volunteers. No pain condition, no sleep disorder, nothing wrong with them. The researcher, Harvey Moldofsky, had noticed something odd on the sleep recordings of his fibrositis patients. And fibrositis was the old name for fibromyalgia before 1990. Even when they were getting a normal number of hours of sleep, their deepest sleep stage looked contaminated. Wide-awake brainwaves were spilling into what should have been the deepest, most restorative part of the night. The question that he wanted answered was quite simple. Was that contamination just a side effect of having the disease, or could breaking that one stage of sleep on its own make someone sick in the first place? Now, how do you even test something like that? Well, he wired healthy volunteers up to an EEG, which is an electroencephalogram, which is the equivalent of an ECG of the brain. Overnight, during sleep, he watched their brainwave trace live. The instant someone dropped into stage 4 sleep, the deepest, slowest wave of sleep of the night, he played a noise through their headphones, loud enough to push the brain into a lighter stage for just a few seconds, but not loud enough to wake them fully. Now, if you do that every single time that deep sleep starts for 3 nights running, you can strip someone of their deep sleep almost entirely, while their total number of hours of sleep is actually barely changing. On paper, it looked like a full night's sleep. The part that was missing every single time was the deep stage, the part that actually does the repairing. And here's the detail that makes this a real experiment rather than an anecdote. He ran a second group at the same time, deprived of REM, which is rapid eye movement or dream sleep instead, using the exact same technique. Now, if it was just any sleep disruption which caused the symptoms to develop, then both groups should have gotten equally sick or similarly so, but they didn't. The deep sleep group developed real measurable muscle tenderness, body heaviness, exhaustion, and low mood. The REM group barely did. And each night it got harder to trigger that arousal. The brain seemed to be fighting to hold on to deep sleep, needing a louder noise each time. Now, that's a genuinely striking result. It's also 50 years old, and it involved 13 people total, 6 in one group and 7 in the other. But nobody ever ran the big version of this study. The handful of follow-up attempts over the following decades was small and inconsistent. The one replication in 12 women found the same pattern, and another attempt found nothing at all. Every study in this specific line has fewer than 20 people in it, and that's not because nobody cared about doing the right study. Deliberately depriving people of the deepest stage of sleep for consecutive nights is actually a genuinely intense thing to run at a large scale. But it does mean that this exact experiment has never actually proven anything at a real size. So does any of that actually hold up outside the test that was done in the lab in the 1970s? Well, in a narrower sense, it does. What has held up? Study after study since then, using gentler methods, just fragmenting sleep or cutting it short rather than surgically removing one stage, is the broader finding underneath it, that if you disrupt someone's sleep and their pain sensitivity goes up. Now, that's been shown again and again in different labs using different techniques until a review published this year describing fragmented sleep as a plausible driver of the same nervous system sensitization seen in fibromyalgia, while stating that this is still an active, unsettled question. Even the specific brainwave pattern Moldofsky built his theory on turned out to be less special than it first looked. It shows up in healthy people too, under the same kind of sleep disruption, so it was never the fibromyalgia fingerprint that it was once thought to be. So nobody's proven bad sleep in itself causes fibromyalgia in a large trial, but smaller tests of the same idea for 50 years keep showing the same result. If disrupted sleep genuinely sensitizes the nervous system to pain, why doesn't everybody who sleeps badly get fibromyalgia? Well, most people who pull an all-nighter don't wake up with a chronic pain condition. This is where the genetics from earlier comes back in. A study published a couple of years ago looked specifically at a gene called PER3, one of the genes that runs your body clock, and found that this gene is significantly more common in people with fibromyalgia than in people without it. Now, that's one study and it needs to be repeated before making any conclusions, but it fits a pattern worth holding on to. Sleep disruption might be what ignites a nervous system that's already genetically primed to overreact. It may require both of these together in the same person to actually result in fibromyalgia. Now, if sleep is a lever here, what's breaking sleep for so many of these patients in the first place? Well, for a lot of fibromyalgia patients, there's a specific treatable answer hiding in plain sight. Restless legs syndrome, that sensation to need to move your legs or your limbs that happens right as you're trying to fall asleep. And it shows up in fibromyalgia patients at a strikingly higher rate than in the general population. And restless leg syndrome has a well-established driver, iron deficiency. Specifically iron in the brain, not necessarily iron in your blood. Now, iron is required to make dopamine, and low brain iron looks like it drives the restless legs in the first place. And why is it so easily missed then? Well, your GP can run a completely normal blood iron panel while the iron level inside your brain and spinal fluid is still low, because the two don't always correlate. A normal blood test does not rule it out. Fibromyalgia patients themselves also run low on iron more often than people without the condition. One study found it in around 2/3 of patients. So how does that chain connect step by step? Low iron limits the brain's dopamine supply, low dopamine seems to drive the restless legs, and restless legs fragments deep sleep night after night in a nervous system that might already be primed to respond badly to exactly that. Now, every link in that chain has support behind it on its own, but nobody has run the single study proving the whole chain from start to finish. So hold this as a strong hypothesis rather than as a settled mechanism. When researchers gave iron-deficient fibromyalgia patients intravenous iron in a proper placebo-controlled trial, the number of patients who hit the study's main target wasn't significantly better than the placebo group. Some of the secondary measures, however, pain and fatigue scores, did move in the right direction. Now, that's a real result, and it's a modest one. Iron is not a cure for fibromyalgia, but if you have fibromyalgia and nobody's ever checked your ferritin, your iron panel, that's a cheap, low-risk blood test worth asking for, regardless of how this particular debate eventually gets settled. Restless legs is not the only sleep disruptor here either, though. Obstructive sleep apnea shows up more often in fibromyalgia patients too, and that one's even more straightforward to test for and treat. Now, if you've ever been told that your fibromyalgia sleep is just something to live with, and nobody's ever screened you for either of these, please tell me in the comments. I suspect that quite a lot of you are in that category. Now, this isn't only a fibromyalgia story. Chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, has unrefreshing deep sleep and refreshing sleep as one of its defining features. Patients describe sleeping for 8 or 9 hours and waking up as though they never went to bed at all. So why would a sleep study on these patients come back looking normal? Now, that's the strange part that researchers keep running into. Often it does look normal. The complaint, however, is real. The standard test is simply not catching what's wrong with it. The gap between what a patient reports and what a machine measures is itself an open research question, and it's not evidence that the patient is mistaken. Pushing through with graded exercise, forcing activity past what the body is signaling, has actually caused real harm in this population, and the evidence behind that approach hasn't held up. Whatever the mechanism turns out to be, pushing harder does not seem to be the answer that the research supports. So where does this leave you practically? 3 things, none of them expensive, none of them a miracle cure. First, if sleep problems are part of what's keeping your nervous system on high alert, the treatment with the strongest evidence behind it is not a pill. It's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. It's genuinely underused in fibromyalgia care and has real trial evidence behind it, which is more than most of what gets offered to people. Second, it's worth asking specifically about restless legs, ferritin, and sleep apnea, rather than waiting to be asked by your doctor. And third, and this is the uncommon sense version of everything I've just walked you through, this was never really only about your genes or about your sleep, but it's about finding the one part of that combination that you can do something about. So stop treating sleep as the least important symptom on the list, the thing that you mentioned last to your doctor after the pain. If even some of what we've been discussing here is correct for you, disrupted sleep likely plays an important role. In a nervous system that's already primed for it, it might be one of the things quietly keeping the disease switched on. Those 13 people in 1976 didn't prove that sleep causes fibromyalgia, and I'm not going to pretend that this video explained that either. Overselling that would really put me in the same category as anyone promising a cure through a supplement stack. But what it does show is that the old assumption that pain breaks your sleep, full stop, end of story, was never as settled as it sounded, and there are testable, treatable pieces sitting underneath it that most people have never been offered. Now, if you want the other half of this story, why some nervous systems are built to react this way in the first place, then that's the genetics video, and you can watch that one over here. This is The Accidental Doctor, a place where we try to make sense of uncommon sense medicine. Stay well, ciao for now, and I'll see you soon.